Coming up, the trade deadline looms. Big Blue has nothing to pursue this season. So, how many players could go out the door? Is anyone interested? And what does it mean based on what they do for the futures of Joe Schoen and Brian Daboll? We dive in next. Yes, my friends, it's OGP, the One Giant Podcast, where you know we are your host. Over here, Adam Arbich. Over there, Andrew Mackowitz. Healthy, wealthy, wise. Talking about the trade deadline coming up on Tuesday. We said this going back a couple of weeks. Hey, they still have 2 more games before they get to the deadline. We'll know exactly what it's going to mean, Andy. We'll have a good sense of, yes, we have a great sense of it. The Giants stink. They're 2-7. And now it's just about how many bodies might get shed here. And before we even get into what teams could be interested in what players, I thought you had the good off-podcast note about we're going to know where the organization stands. Joe Schoen, Brian Daboll, John Mara, the future of it all. You could learn a lot by the time we get to the deadline on Tuesday.
Yeah, it feels like there's going to be a message that is sent one way or another. And I mean that in regards to the trade deadline and what the Giants decide to do. I think we both agree that the New York Giants have virtually no chance of making the playoffs this year. The season is pretty much done. And so when you philosophically know that you're not going to be able to make the playoffs, you got to start thinking about what the long-term strategy is for the organization. Now, if Joe Schoen and Brian Daboll are concerned about whether or not their job is actually safe, then they are going to do everything still in their power this season to be able to win football games. And that means not trading guys that you may not have back next season, but you critically need right now in order to function as an offense or a defense or whatever it's going to be. Now, if the Giants and John Mara and company have come out to Joe Schoen and Brian Daboll and said, we trust the process. You will be here next year. We need to think about the long-term viability of this organization. You have carte blanche to start tearing it down to build it back up. Then all of a sudden you may see the Giants actually trade away players that we've talked about for seasons upon seasons about whether they'd be here or not. Obviously, guys like Darius, Slayton, and Azeez Oulari come to mind. But yeah, don't you feel the same way that if the Giants do actually become sellers at this deadline, then it makes me feel like there are assurances that they will be back next season?
Yeah, it's interesting. I think I mostly do, right? But in the case of like Azeez Oulari, previous regime's draft pick, or in Darius Slayton, 5th round guy who's bubbled up and, has been a good player. We've liked him, but does he matter critically to the future? I think, to your point, if you're keeping these guys around because the organization believes that Brian Daboll needs to prove something from a coaching standpoint. Well, one, as you pointed out at the time, John Mara's words about, hey, we're good, we're going to see it through, we believe in the plan, it's all a bunch of fluff until you see the actual results. So I think that does matter. If I want to believe John Mara, then trade the guys away, right? And it doesn't matter. You're going to develop for the future, and who cares? And you want to build up for this regime. My only caveat would be, though, you can trade away players and get more draft picks and set yourself up. I want to talk about compensatory factors here when it comes to some of these decisions. You can do all that to set yourself up to fire everybody and then bring in the new regime, and you want to have the most draft picks possible and guys that you don't intend on re-signing next season anyway, like almost at a high level. If John Mara is talking to whomever about the nuts and bolts of, are we bringing back Azeez Oulari at $9-10 million APY? Probably not. Okay, then it doesn't matter who we're keeping or not here. So I think there is a little bit there when it comes to it, but that may be all relative to the idea that you come in as Brian Daboll and Joe Schoen, you spike the playoffs, and then everything has been downtrending since then. So you really have to truly believe the vision is out there versus being informed by what your eyes are telling you and how you feel about individual players, QB play, all that kind of stuff.
Well, you brought up a good point, Adam. I wasn't saying whether or not John Mara actually brings Joe Schoen and Brian Daboll back, because what we've seen is the vote of confidence from him for the past 2 head coaches within a month.
The vote of confidence is a real concern if John Mara gives it to you.
Yeah, like when he's like, you guys are safe, you're like, that didn't work out too well for the last 2 guys that you said that to. Within a month of giving the vote of confidence to Joe Judge and others, gone, right? And so for me, like I don't know necessarily whether or not like the next few games are going to change things. I do wonder perceptually, like if the Giants do decide to make some moves at the deadline and get a mid round pick for someone like Azeez Ojulari or explore what there is out there for Darius Slayton, I do wonder what the expectations are from ownership on what type of product the Giants are going to put out for the rest of the season.
Sure.
Because John Mara does not want to be embarrassed. And
He
the
already
last
is being
coaches
embarrassed.
that
And,
got
and
let
I'm not
go.
this, it's not your point, but like he doesn't want it. Like, so what he's thinking, what he wants to do, but like they already are getting embarrassed. They're already a 2-7 team. This is where I think that he's flawed in if you think your fan base doesn't already think this is a bad product that you're putting out there and you don't want to get embarrassed, it's already happening. You're already in it. So what are you trying to salvage? Which it's not you, but it's like John
Yeah.
Merritt.
It's if you squint hard enough, like we said before, you're
5
in
and
these
12
one
and say,
possession games and you're losing all of them. At
yeah,
least it keeps people in his mind
yes, in
slightly
his mind.
engaged with the product itself.
Yeah.
If it is a stage of futility for the Giants where like getting 7 points, like even scoring in the double digits,
For
and
sure.
like we're just getting blown out, like that raises to a level of like the franchise is a joke. Now, you might feel like everything is a joke right now, like this whole thing is a joke, but I don't believe John Mara thinks that's the perception of it. So
Sure.
it's this delicate balance of like we still want to be competitive. We understand we're going to lose games. Don't embarrass me though. I feel like is kind of the mandate that's going to come down.
Yes, and you're speaking as John Mara, not as Andy Makowitz. I would say,
Correct.
like, as Andy Makowitz and Adam Armbrecht, who cares? This is the
Right.
first
Right.
time that I would say you and I are typically we say, hey, you go out on Sunday, team's playing well, you want to see them win a game. Like it feels good to watch your team win football games. So we're always late to the party on the idea of tank, right? You should always be tanking. Now you look around the league and you see what Jaden Daniels is doing. You go, we should have tanked. We should have lost all those games, right? Even Drake May, injuries. They took his time getting him into the starting lineup, but you see him. Then you see an Anthony Richardson and you go, well, it's not always rose-colored lenses here. You see a player like Bryce Young, you go, oh, okay, it's not always the easy answer, right? So that's the push and pull for me. But at this moment right now, if you are John Mara and you believe in the process and you trust it, then stop caring about the wins and losses and what it looks like on the field. Because you're saying, I believe in Joe Schoen, I believe in Brian Daboll, and I'm hanging my hat on developmentally what they're doing with players and what they're setting up for, not what I'm seeing on the field, which, by the way, is really hard to separate and have that strong disconnect. Go ahead. I want to get into something about this, the trade deadline, and when we think about certain players and how it factors in.
Yeah, I have a trivia question for you. The
Oh.
Giants are one of two teams right now that do not have a win at home. The Giants
Okay.
are 0-5. So when we talk about being embarrassed, you're getting embarrassed in front of your own fan base where you can't even win a home game. It's going to be hard to sell those medium Pepsis and those Budweisers later on in the season. The Giants are 0-5 at home. There is another team that is winless. Can you name which team that is, Adam?
The obvious one would be say to the Carolina Panthers, but I'm gonna go. I'm gonna go with the team I just talked about, Drake May. I'm gonna say the Patriots because I feel like maybe that's a sneaky one.
The Patriots have a win. They beat the Bengals week 1 of the season at home in like that shocking upset. It is the
Classic
Dallas
Bengals.
Cowboys as the other team that has not won a home
That's a
game
fun
yet.
trivia, Andy. Nice
And,
job.
and
Yeah.
in the NFC East, you have two teams that have not. The Giants and the Cowboys are combined 0-8 at home this season, which is like inconceivable when you think about how like Jerry World and what he's thinking about. But it's just the Giants are so far away from being ultra competitive that you really do feel, and I think you feel the same way, is the Giants are going to have to hit the bottom before they can rise again. And being in this like weird state of like, hey, we're competitive enough to have like the 9th or 10th pick in the draft isn't really going to change the direction of the franchise longer term, in my opinion.
Yeah, and that's so just quickly. That's why when you tie back to Mara and you tie back to the playoff season, I think, and even Joe Shane, everyone fell underneath the ambrosia of it. But you wanted it to be that was really cool, wasn't it, everybody? But I and Brian Daboll and the organization believe we need to go to the studs with this thing and build ourselves back up to be a consistently competitive year-over-year playoff team. So, no Daniel Jones contract, even no Saquon Barkley contract. I was like, nobody. We are actually going to do this, and we know it's painful. The Rangers did this in hockey a handful of years ago. They came out and they said, hey, fans, this is going to suck. but we promise you that it's going to be good for us another year and a half, 2 years from now. And it was, and it has been, and they remain one of the more competitive year-over-year teams now with great chances and great odds to win the cup every season. So that's something that the Giants and John Mara seem unwilling to do. Now, when we talk about the trade deadline and player moves, Dan Duggan actually directed everyone's attention over to Nick Corte, who is, in his words, paraphrasing, the guy to go to when it comes to implications, compensatory picks, and all those formulas. Someone had mentioned at Nick Corte about if Azeez is indeed going to get something around 10 million APY as a free agent, do you think that that's a fourth or fifth round compensatory pick in 2026? So why would you worry about trading, not trading, etc., in terms of making sure that you lock that in for a free agent, right? Who leaves and who comes in all affects it. But as Nick accurately reminds everybody, yes, but you still got to get to the point of having sent out more than what you brought in. So
Yep.
trading, as we get into value for Azeez Ojulari, it's like, is it a fifth? Does it end up being a sixth? Does it really matter? What really matters is getting that player out the door, letting him go sign the contract somewhere else, and it all sorts itself out, as opposed to waiting it out and playing the game of where's the best value. Doesn't matter if future compensatory X happens. You got to make sure you're there. And we know the Giants, Barkley, Xavier McKinney, but they also brought in Brian Burns. So you're doing that equation and that math all the time. And this is like the beyond the football thing that fans on a pure Sunday basis don't want to talk about. But this is the math they're doing behind the closed doors.
Yeah, well, the Brian Burns thing was fascinating in terms of the compensatory picks. Joe Schoen actually had Carolina do the extension and then trade, so that like it didn't hit the compensatory picks a certain way, which I found fascinating.
Sure.
To your point, the other big elephant in the room in all this is the compensatory pick is not for this upcoming draft; it's for the following draft, Adam.
Right.
And it's like, what good does that do Joe Schoen if he's not here anymore and the team doesn't have assets to be able to build this thing up again? So if you're telling me that he could get a sixth round pick tomorrow, as opposed to the potential of a compensatory pick in the fifth round 2 years from now, when you don't even know what free agents you're going to be looking to sign, you take the bird in the hand, you try to get as much draft capital as you can for this upcoming draft to hopefully reload and bring an influx of talent into a roster that desperately needs it.
And so on that note, by the way, Nick Forte of Over the Cap, when he talks about how it looked, this is going back to the off season. So I don't know if this is it looks like this was pre bringing in Brian Burns, if I had this correct. They had 5 going out, 4 coming in. So it looked like they were in a position, but then they turned around and made the Burns deal as well. So that could impact it as far as what they'll get in this upcoming season. The other thing for me then, so when we sit here and we talk about like what moves should you make, what do you need to do? Do you care what the value is on these guys? Like, let's just put aside the idea competitive, not competitive, what you would need to prove as Brian Daboll. Do you care what the draft value is on a Darius Slayton, on a Azeez Ojulari? Or is it just like, let's just get what we can, let's stockpile, and let's just have more shots to fire when it comes to the NFL draft?
Yeah, well, I do a little bit. I'm not
Okay.
going to get choosy over a fourth or a fifth round pick. The market will bear out exactly what that's going to be. Where I think I would take a pause is, what if you're getting offered a seventh round pick swap for Darius Slayton? Like, what does that actually do when you think about, like, there are other players that we need to evaluate on the roster. We still need a functioning offense to see if these players can actually do what they need to do. To me, like,
Okay.
swapping the seventh round to get picked 10 picks earlier, to me, is just an example of something where I'd be like, no, Darius Slayton has more value to the team being here for the last few games than swapping a late round pick like that. So
But
I
but
will
value
say,
to what though? Like, I know what you're
well,
saying, but, like, value to what? Like, okay, Darius Slayton gets traded, and we like Darius Slayton, and I think that I think I'd be perfectly happy if Darius Slayton was, like, a giant lifer and just slid down the
yes,
depth chart
I
accordingly.
agree.
That's another discussion for another day probably. Um, but okay, he gets traded, Isaiah Hodgins is brought up, and now he's playing reps, and everybody moves up the pick. Okay. Or Jalen Hyatt now plays reps. Like, what the value lost is relative to what the team can gain. The team can't gain anything here. They're 2-7.
Well, yeah, I just mean like the way that the team needs to work on the field. I'm just thinking, like, you have to
Sure,
evaluate every
functional.
position, right? And so, like, having a Darius Slayton out there makes you a better offense than not having a Darius Slayton out there. And so, if you want to look at Tommy DeVito, or you're wondering if Drew Lock's the answer, or Evan Neal's going to be out there and you want to evaluate him, you still need competent players around the field in order to be able to evaluate other players properly. Like, I know what I'm getting from Darius Slayton. I know that he's a guy, to your point, I want him to be a Giant. I would love if the Giants could figure a way to keep him here longer term without mortgaging the future. But yeah, I get what you're saying. You're like, who cares if it's Isaiah Hodgins or Darius Slayton? Take the 10 pick swap if it was that egregious, and at least get any value for it, because nothing matters on the field. I think, the evaluation of some other players on the field is just something in the back of my mind where I kind of have that break-even point.
Currently, the Giants are 7th overall now in Tankathon. They moved up a couple of spots in recent weeks. They've lost 4 in a row. A team like New Orleans has lost 7 in a row. That's one of those surprise teams that you didn't think it was going to be good or bad, whatever, but you didn't think they were going to be this bad, right?
And
Lost
guess
Derek
what?
Carr for a stretch.
And guess what? Dennis Allen was just fired 2 hours ago for the New Orleans Saints after losing 7 straight games. So
it's a fun one too. I always appreciate when head coaches, and I don't need to defend, Allen here, but it's always fun when, you get fired after your starting QB, whatever you think about Derek Carr, has been out and you've been playing Spencer Rattler. Like, hey, I don't know how you evaluate things, and I'm not saying he shouldn't have been gone. Bottom line is, though, there's a head coach out the door. And then you still have, and now Jacksonville as well. That's the other team. Guess what? They lost their second in a row over the weekend. So now you have Jacksonville and New Orleans are 2 new teams in that mix there. So even though the Giants, all these 2-7 teams that are hanging out there right now, they're still 7th and trying to climb up the board there. You mentioned about, I think a future conversation is going to be after we get through this deadline. And we're going to close out on surprises that we think could come here in terms of the trades for the Giants. But I think the other thing we'll talk about is who do we already know to be what they are on the roster, and who do we think we can learn about that makes it worth if they don't trade anybody. Why we keep Azeez Oulari? Well, maybe because we want to learn about depth on the interior of the defensive line. Maybe we want to learn about linebackers, and it's good to have that player because Kayvon Thibodeau's still going to be coming back, et cetera, right? Like, all of that stuff could factor into evaluation of other players. But can you make a long enough list of those players you want to learn about to justify it? That'll come maybe midweek. Who knows? We'll talk about it. In the short term, who is a surprising guy that you think could be traded here for the Giants that maybe doesn't impact any of that functionality on either side of the football, where you just go, yeah, it just made sense. This guy wasn't long for this team and wasn't really getting a lot of reps right now either.
Yeah, it's tough because we've mentioned Azeez Oulari as a likely candidate because he has some value to other people around the league. You look at the Atlanta Falcons, make too much sense to not make that happen. You mentioned Darius Slayton as obviously another one just because of the way his contract is. I said this on one of our last episodes that like virtually no one should be off limits at this point. Now, like trading Dexter Lawrence right now, you would need a king's ransom because he's your best player and you can build around him for the next 7 to 10 years if you really wanted to. There's a couple guys that come to my mind, Adam, that I'm wondering what the plan is. One is Adoree Jackson. Would anyone take Adoree Jackson at this point? I know we're thin at cornerback, but he's a veteran. Does someone need a warm body in there? You may as well. Even if you're thin at the position, you may as well go do that. The other one that I mentioned it before and you raised your eyebrow at it a couple times because you're like, is Jason Pinnock. I am wondering, a 25-year-old safety that has shown flashes, do the Giants intend on bringing him back at a $10 to $12 million number? We just saw what Xavier McKinney got. And now I don't think Jason Pinnock is at Xavier McKinney's level. But
you're not talking about paying $19 million. You're talking about paying him $10 to $12 million. Yeah.
Right. And so if you're going to allocate $12 million to Jason Pinnock, you almost would turn around and say, why didn't we just give more to Xavier McKinney to stay? But the question is, are they going to go with the full rebuild? Is it going to be Dane Belton and Tyler Nubin, and then you just go out and get a veteran free agent for the league minimum? Do you think Jason Pinnock is a guy that may not be here after the deadline?
I could see it. I guess I probably the real question would be, it's like name the team, name the situation where the value is worth it, right? And by the way, though, if the Giants say, hey, thanks for the 5th round pick, thanks for the 6th round pick, it almost certainly would be worth it. You need to probably look around the league and say, like, here's a team that has aspirations, that need this guy, and that maybe sit there in their safety room and say, we wouldn't mind paying Pinnock $10 to $12 million in the off season and bringing him back on a 4-year contract that then solidifies our room. So no, I listen, you have Dane Belton still. That's a regime draft pick. Obviously, Tyler Nubin, with where you took him, the expectations is like he's going to be your Xavier McKinney, you know, as far as the value that he brings to your roster, not the same type of safety play. But if that's the case, then yeah, what are we doing? Now you want to tell me you wait and next year at the deadline, you bring him back on a deal that makes sense that you can negotiate with. That's possible. And this would probably be my only concern here. And at a high level, I think what we're talking about, we mentioned about compensatory picks for Azeez Ojulari and otherwise. If you don't make the choices now, so it goes back to the top of, well, you want to stay competitive, you want to evaluate guys. Good for you. If I turn around at the end of the year and I didn't learn shockingly new revelations about certain players because I kept Azeez and because I kept Pinnock and because I kept Darius Slayton, then all I'm going to turn around and say is, in a lot of these cases, well, there he goes. Bye-bye. Compensatory pick down the road, be damned. I'm going to watch all these guys walk. And if there's a marginal benefit of 6th round compensatory pick versus 5th round at the deadline, right? Like that matters. And you also mentioned earlier, do I want to trade Darius Slayton for a pick swap? You know, well, maybe not. But if it's the right team and I could get to the back end of the 5th round for Darius Slayton in our 7th round, yeah, I would probably make that deal. Now, Slayton has a contract, you know, so different with these different players. But I don't mind the idea of that. I don't mind the idea of having 4 5th-round picks instead of a 6th and a 7th going into next year's draft. So, you know, I do look at it somewhat coldly, as in, if this team is bad, which we all know they are, then I want as many opportunities to make them better. And I just think it's probably worth doing it now. And the Giants have always been an organization that historically struggles to make the tough decision at the right time, and then they suffer for it later. And you can look at that at the very highest of levels with Saquon Barkley and moving him at some point before you let him walk in free agency.
Last name that is going to be a surprise name to you, but I
There you go.
want to get your feedback and hear me out on this one.
Sure.
Shane Bowen runs a completely different
You're going to
system.
trade Shane Bowen?
Can we get a 5th-round pick? I'm in.
What are we talking about? Talk about compensation.
Yeah, you just said 3 5th-round picks. If we got to give away our coordinators, the water boy, like whoever it's going to be, he's got to go. Shane Bowen's system, for me, has not looked great on Bobby Okereke.
Interesting. I was just scrolling. I didn't know whatever, but like I just was scrolling through the depth chart and was like just coming around to Bobby Okereke. And while you're about to say it, I was like thinking, has he had the same type of high season, impact season that we saw from him a year ago in a different system? Yeah, go ahead.
He has not. He punched the ball out early on in the year, but he has not looked great in run defense. He has not looked great adjusting to Shane Bowen's system. He's got a $6 million cap hit this year. Next year, it goes up to $14 million for Bobby Okereke. The Giants have an out where they can cut him after the season and incur a $10 million dead cap hit, and they can recoup some of the money. But Adam, like, I really like Bobby Okereke. He likes being a Giant. He's one of those guys that you wish would be here. But these are some of the tough decisions that you mentioned before that the Giants have never been willing to do. But keep in mind, he's 28 years old. He's turning 29 next season. So you're talking about a 29-year-old middle linebacker playing out of scheme, out of sorts under Shane Bowen with a $14 million cap hit. It's at least something that the Giants have to explore. Is there a team that maybe has an injury in their linebacking core where Bobby Okereke could make an impact? Tell me what you think about Bobby Okereke potentially being a candidate.
Listen, in terms of, let's put it in context for Andy, like he's talking about, hey, what would be a surprise? But
right,
yeah, like this goes back to the highest possible level. I think this team is still further than closer. I don't think it's just spike the top draft pick and get QBX. I think there's functional fits to what you're talking about with Bobby Okereke that maybe don't totally make sense. I think there's financial thoughts. Even though the Giants are going to have better cap space, they brought in Brian Burns. That there is big money there. Dexter Lawrence, Andrew Thomas. There's guys that are on the books for money here. So if you look at Bobby Okereke and you think, now I don't know, pure off the wall, it's like, oh, is there 3rd round value in a trade for Bobby Okereke from team? Is it 4th round? There's a game to be played there for what his value and talent level is, but age and money, to your point. 2 years from now, if the Giants are still kind of a muddling team, you're not going to get more value for a player at 30 than you do at 28. You're not going to get more value for a player that doesn't fit into your scheme and maybe isn't putting good film on tape. That's a really interesting one. And Pinnock is another one that you brought up previously in terms of no one should be untouchable. I think we would core ourselves down to players we want to see be here. But Bobby Okereke is not a drafted giant, right? He's not a player that I think the fan base looks at and goes, oh man, he speaks to true blue. Even though his play a year ago brought back some of that linebacker identity, I wonder the choices the Giants would make there, even if it was just to make cap space to go pursue a better fit in free agency this offseason. That's a good one, man. It's a hard one, painful one, but a good one.
Yeah, I mean, Adam, at the end of the day, the Giants have to take a long, hard look in the mirror, and they're going to have some very uncomfortable conversations with players that are key contributors on a 2-7 team, right? This isn't like you are what your record says you are. At 2-7, you can't look and say, well, man, he played great last year. It's like, well, what by the time we're ready to compete again, you said a 30-year-old middle linebacker, if $15 million a year doesn't necessarily scream value for the Giants. And so for me, I just look at this, Adam, and I say, tongue in cheek, yeah, everyone is on the trade block, but really there's about 7 or 8 guys in total that you're like, these are the guys that I know will be here in the next 2 years. Let's build around them. Everyone else you have to have at least a discussion about.
And by the way, the Giants got Brian Burns because the Carolina Panthers looked around their roster and said, we're not that good. Are we going to keep Brian Burns here and pay him big dollars on our bad team? Is it going to make a difference? Guess what? We have Brian Burns. It's not making a difference. And he's a good player. He's a great player, but it's not changing the outcome. Dexter Lawrence is a great player. It's not changing the outcome. The sum of the parts matter here. It is the QB, and it's more than the QB. It is wide receiver depth, and it's more than just depth, offensive line, etc. It all plays a factor here, and we'll see. If anything happens at the deadline, we'll come back in and then reset the table for the back end of this season. What do we want to evaluate? Who do we want to watch for? And guess what? Andy's favorite player on the Giants roster, Evan Neal. Yeah, he's probably going to see the field at some point here over the back half of this season. That's all fun stuff we're going to talk about, though. You get us on YouTube because we'll be on there. You get us on the podcast feed because you'll hear us there. And we'll be talking about it, man, all season long in spite of the losses. I'm not going to say wins or losses. I'm just going to say losses because that's what it feels like. Giants go to Germany next. They'll be overseas, little early morning game. That'll be a fun one. We'll be back in breaking it down midweek, talking about the results, if any, from the trade deadline. But until the next time, until the best times, we remind you first that today's episode was brought to you by Potential. Pietential. Potential is an online wellness assessment tool, sets a baseline for your well-being, gives you tools to improve over time, and tracks your progress. Check it out. Pietential.com. As Andrew Makowitz now would want, need, and demand the people know.
As always, let's go Big Blue.